Welcome to the New Books Network.
Hello and welcome to Madison's Notes, the official podcast of Princeton University's James Madison program in American Ideals and Institutions. I'm your host, Annika Nordquist. This week's guest is Professor W. Brad Wilcox, who's a professor of sociology at the University of Virginia, where he also directs the National Marriage Project. In addition, he's a Future of Freedom Fellow at the Institute for Family Studies and a non-resident senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. Today, we're here to talk about his new book, a cause near and dear to my heart. It's called Get Married: Why Americans Should Defy the Elite, Forge Strong Families, and Save Civilization. There's so much discussion of marriage and dating and having kids in today's public discourse, but very few people who have Dr. Wilcox's ability to really delve deep into the data about why to get married, when to get married, and what marriage does for society. I hope you find this conversation both theoretically interesting and practically useful, as I know I certainly did. So with no further ado, I hope you enjoy. Dr. Wilcox, welcome to the show. It is a real delight to have you on.
Thanks, Annika. It's great to be here with you.
Yeah, and I gotta say, this is such a full circle moment for me because when I was in college, my college pastor used to send your work around all the time. So it's very exciting for me to be able to chat with you now.
Yep, great. That's hysterical.
So to kick us off, and I am currently engaged, full disclosure, so playing a little bit of devil's advocate here. But right now, you've written this book. Marriage is going to fix all your problems. Marriage is going to make you happy. It's going to make you richer. It's going to save civilization is in the subtitle. Right. And yet 40% of marriages-ish right now end in divorce. So if marriage really does all these amazing things, what is it that 40% of people are missing out on?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So I think what we're seeing is that we still have, many cultural currents sort of coursing through our culture that are pushing young adults and middle-aged adults, obviously, and not to mention the boomers who are still divorcing in record numbers.
Still, they're not done yet.
And they're not done divorcing. They've got to keep up their reputation. But seriously, right? So I think, and I'm not saying that every marriage should go the distance. Clearly, when there are cases, involving things like, for instance, domestic violence or, drug abuse or, serial infidelity, these are all cases where, marriages shouldn't go the distance. But, there are a lot of factors, in the culture today that are pushing people kind of in a more what I call me first direction in the book. And they don't recognize and don't realize that when you kind of live for yourself in marriage, it often ends in disaster. When you don't kind of embrace the all-in mentality that we see, classically linked to marriage, you're also more likely to fail as well. When you don't kind of recognize that, every relationship that's kind of important and meaningful tends to have difficult days, weeks, chapters, you're likely to land in a bad spot as well. So I think part of the challenge today is that, too many Americans don't recognize and realize that embracing a family first mindset where you're trying to put your spouse and your kids' well-being, ahead of your own, recognizing the importance of kind of working through conflicts constructively, recognizing that there is something to be said about, marital permanence. There's something to be said too about fidelity, not embracing every new option that might come down, the road or nowadays some internet portal, that it's these sort of classic values and virtues that will sustain a strong and stable marriage. And it's the kinds of people who are steering clear of a lot of the bad advice we're getting from our elites that are more likely to find themselves stably and happily married.
So because you're a quant guy, I feel empowered to ask, do we actually have any sense of how many marriages are actually ending kind of for ideological reasons like the ones that you're laying out versus the reasons that people more traditionally think of as leading to divorce?
Well, what we do see in the research is that there is no group of Americans who are more stably married. I think I began in the introduction talking about this. when it comes to parents, who obviously in some ways are the most important group, because our kids are more likely to flourish with stably married parents, the most stably married Americans are Americans who are college educated and conservative, right? So that's a fact. My colleague and friend Richard Reeves has sort of talked about, well, college educated Americans are doing so well because they're kind of, they're a little bit more liberal on social issues, and they kind of are, pragmatic and prudential about marriage today, living kid-centered lives. What Richard doesn't appreciate, though, is that when you break out the college-educated set by the conservative, who are a minority, obviously, in that world, versus the liberals, in that world, the conservatives are winning hands down in terms of both happiness and marital happiness, marital equality, and marital stability.
There's a lot of common misconceptions in the discourse that I'm going to it's maybe going to be a bit of a laundry list, but we'll try to work through it. But I mean, one maybe confounding factor that I'd be curious if you have any insight on is people who go to college marry later, usually after they finish college. And I mean, most people are quite adamant that that's the responsible thing to do, to kind of wait to get married. I mean, most people would even say right out of college is too young. You should wait until you're more settled in your career and what have you. Is that true? Or to what extent is that true?
So it is true that when it comes to marital stability, kind of for the average person, kind of getting married in your late 20s or early 30s is associated with the most marital stability. So that's sort of like dovetails with that kind of elite wisdom, right? But there are at least two exceptions that I've identified, or that colleagues have identified. So some colleagues have looked at couples who are attending religious services together, and for them, kind of getting married in their 20s, broadly defined as, no extra risk for divorce for them. And then Lyman Stone and I, Lyman is a PhD in demography at McGill, we found in our research that getting directly married in your mid-20s, roughly defined, without cohabiting first, is linked to comparatively low risks of divorce. So I think it's just important to recognize and realize here, Annika, that if you're kind of generating a kind of a complex relationship history with lots of different configurations and partners and cohabiting situations, then for whatever reason, maybe kind of waiting until you're around 28, 29, 30, 31 might be the best strategy. But if you kind of either are religious or kind of just really, devoted to your boyfriend or girlfriend, and, you're not accumulating some kind of complicated relationship history, it looks like getting married in your mid-20s is not a risk factor for divorce. And the other piece of that no one in this world knows about, though, is that the most happily married people are folks who get married in their mid-20s.
Oh, interesting.
And I think the story, right, is that you can get started more quickly on the business of getting married and having a family, and you're establishing common, routines, traditions, vacations. You're kind of planning your life together. You have more kids. You're more likely to be on the same page ideologically and religiously, because often I think you're probably picking someone maybe where you're not. I think like the longer you wait to marry someone, the more likely you are to pick kind of someone who's available rather than like your true love, so to speak. So I think that's part of what's happening here too. But anyways, the story for marital stability and marital equality is a little bit different. And if you're thinking just about marital equality, definitely get married in your mid-20s. If you're worried about stability and you're just the generic person, you could wait a little bit. But the final thing that I would say too is we are seeing just an incredible surge in young adults like yourself who are basically, we're projecting, are never going to marry and never have children. So Lyman Stone is projecting, and I'm projecting, that about 1 in 3 young adults today will never marry. And that's record demographic territory. And so my view is that if you meet someone who's really a great person, and there's a great friendship in college, there is nothing that should stop you from getting married to that person, early 20s, mid-20s, whatever. But you can't assume that they're just going to be waiting for you when you hit, 28, basically.
Oh, I have so many questions based on that, but I appreciate what you said about, people who wait for 30, because I recently had a conversation with another young woman who, I mean, because I'm more religious, a lot of my friends have gotten married very young. And she was like, well, if you're getting married at 22, does that mean that you just want to get married and you pick someone? And I'm like, I mean, if you're getting married at 28, especially, I guess that kind of leads into the next question, but especially if you're a girl, it's quite likely that you'll freak out and take whatever option you have. But I mean, that is also something that is, I mean, I wouldn't even say it's really in the discourse because it's super controversial. There's sort of a far right-wing discourse that really emphasizes biological differences between men and women and leans into marrying younger women. And then there's a far left discourse that really, really does not want to talk about it. Don Lemon, I think, made a comment about there being such a thing as a woman's prime and had
Right.
to like apologize, and it was a whole thing. Between kind of those two extremes,
Sure.
what's your view on how should men and women be thinking about when to marry differently?
Yeah, I mean, I do think that men are less mature than women. It takes us just longer to mature physically and I think emotionally in many cases. So I think it makes sense that couples would marry roughly the same age, or as my wife and I did, we were both fourth years at the University of Virginia. We met in the spring of our senior year and, dated for a couple of years and got married. And we're just a few months apart. Or when the guy's, somewhat older than the woman, and he's just had a chance to mature, and figure out his identity a little bit, and is sort of forging his way in the world and is capable of commitment, and and is ready to be a reliable husband. So yes, I would sort of say, broadly speaking, that we would expect that couples who are roughly the same age or couples where he is a bit older are ones that are going to be more likely to flourish, just sort of given the dynamics that take place in terms of how men develop versus how women develop. And then also I think too, women do tend to prefer to marry men who are either roughly the same status as they are or have some kind of higher status than they do as well. And given the broader dynamics that are playing out in higher education and the workforce, obviously today, we see that a lot of women are outperforming the men in their social world. And so, it's harder for them to realize that, older, more traditional pattern. But I still think that when you look at kind of who's getting married, you do see plenty of evidence indicating that women, tend to prefer guys who are doing well when it comes to either education or work or some other kind of important socially valued, domain.
I mean, it is interesting because, you open your book with Andrew Tate, which was a very bold choice. Going against Andrew Tate for the listeners,
Sure, right,
everyone calm down. But it does seem like that kind of attitude does play into, I don't know, at least kind of in that corner, some kind of masculine fear that women will somehow, sap away kind of accumulated wealth for men. Is that true?
Well, obviously divorce is a problem. And when divorce happens, men often lose big financially,
Right.
And that's a real concern that, that many young men have about marriage today. But it's important just to sort of acknowledge that most marriages go the distance today, as we, just touched on. And so for the average guy who gets and stayed married, he's just in a much better financial position throughout the life course than he would be had he not married. So we know that, basically stably married guys have about 10 times the assets in their 50s as they get closer to retirement compared to never married men. Now, part of that's a selection effect, right? But there's just no question that men who get married work harder, they work more strategically, they're less likely to be fired. And couples who are married are more likely to be prudential in how they spend their money. They're more likely to accumulate a major asset in the form of a house and a 401k, portfolio that kind of are going to put them into a relatively better position, as they move towards retirement. It's important too that there was this story in Bloomberg that said that women who stay single and don't have kids are getting richer, kind of implying that women who steer clear of marriage and motherhood are in a better financial position than women who get married and have kids. And what the article neglected was actually any data on married women was just astonishing. It was completely, foul up on Bloomberg's part. But we know too that married women have more than 10 times the assets, compared to their never married female peers on average. So for the average person, marriage really does boost your financial well-being too. And that's an important point as you kind of, just to be honest, as you kind of like, think about, the realities of life. And there's still an Austinian, as in Jane Austen, kind of, reality out there that people don't always want to talk about. But it's true that, if you get married and stay married to a reasonably good person, you're going to be in a way better financial position than if you never marry, or if you marry someone who's not a good fit or a good match, or, of high character, and end up getting divorced, obviously.
Yeah. The money question is so, I mean, it's strange because I feel like in my lifetime, I've watched the public discourse go from, oh, it's not about money to it's all about money. I mean, you've called this in interviews and in your work, the Midas mindset. How much should that actually affect the way we think about marriage?
I mean, I think kind of, that's a great question. I think that we should attach some significance to money in terms of thinking about a spouse and thinking about marriage, more generally, but not, ultimate significance to money. And so what I would say is that kind of attaching too much importance to money gets you in trouble, and it leads you to invest too much in, your career or in just money-making strategies, and often consumption patterns that are going to make you and your spouse and your kids miserable. At the same time, I do see that couples, both personally and in the data, where the husbands are not reliable breadwinners, are more likely to land in real trouble. What's striking is that, there's research from Sasha Kellewell at Harvard in sociology telling us that when the wife loses her job, there's no effect on marital stability. When the husband loses his job, a 33% increase in the risk of divorce. This is a big difference between husbands and wives and marriage and work. So it's still the case in 2024, Annika, that often implicitly, right, not explicitly, but implicitly, husbands and wives attach more importance to his stable work than they do to hers. It's particularly true when there are children in the picture. And so I think we would kind of help ourselves to sort of do more to encourage people to be cognizant of that reality. And one reason I think that, and ironically, I was criticized in the New York Times, as a scold by a progressive journalist. And she said that, well, there aren't enough marriageable men out there. Why are you encouraging us to get married, given the fact that we're not finding enough men out there who are worthy of marriage? And I think what she doesn't appreciate, though, is that if you don't put marriage on men's front burner, right, on their radar screen, many men are not going to rise to the occasion to be marriageable, right? So in other words, if you kind of like basically exclude marriage from men's thinking, or you put it down to age 30 or 35, right? Then for a lot of guys in their teens and 20s, they're just not going to be all that intentional about education or work, right? And then ironically, they're not going to be as attractive as potential boyfriends and husbands. And then you're going to complain about the lack of marriageable men, right? So we have to realize that money does matter to some extent, and that we should do a better job, particularly of preparing our young men for marriage and for a vocation that would make them, a reliable breadwinner, and therefore a more attractive boyfriend and husband as well.
I mean, our culture focuses a lot on, career and money. And I think at least part of the reason why people focus on that at the expense of marriage is that there's this I'll just be frank, a lot of this is also the perception I was raised with, that you can really prepare for your education and for your career, and you can't really prepare yourself to meet the one. Or maybe you can prepare in some sort of vague way, but so much of it is up to chance that there's not really anything that you can do to control it. So you should just sort of forget about it until it happens to you. Is that true?
No, not at all. I think people are, we're kidding ourselves, right? So I think we have to realize, that number one, people who meet one another in in-person contexts are more likely to be happily married than folks who meet on the internet, or actually also in one context in a bar or tavern, based on work done by my colleague, Dr. Wendy Wang. Now, is this causal? Who knows?
Sorry, bar or tavern is in the same category as internet?
As internet, yes. Right.
Oh,
so
interesting.
What she found was that couples who who met their spouse either in a religious context, church or some kind of religious event, or at a social event, like like a friend's party, right?
Right.
Or at work or in college, right? were more likely to be flourishing. Now, and again, this can be a selection effect. Whereas folks you met their spouse on the internet or at a bar or tavern were not doing so well. But it just suggests to us that I think trying to kind of, make the effort to socialize in person, meet people in a wide range of contexts in person, will maximize your chances. And then, having the courage to ask someone out on a date or to be willing to say yes to a date. I mean, I can't tell you how many people kind of tell us stories about how their wife was initially kind of, a little bit hesitant to go on that first date or the second date, and had to be sort of won over, but now are happily married. People like Arthur Brooks, who's at Harvard's business school, kind of tells that story. And there are plenty of cases like his, where he had to kind of convince his wife, Esther, when they were initially dating, that this was all going to, work out well. So yeah, I mean, I think encouraging adults to be a lot more persistent than they are about, giving dating a chance, meeting a wide range of people, and getting off their phones and doing more in-person things. That's so important. But then even thinking too about their, where they land in their 20s for work, right? No one talks about this, but, Joe Price is an economist at BYU. Dan Lichter, I think his colleague for this paper, is an economist or actually a social scientist at Cornell. Then I think maybe one other person did this paper looking at kind of marriageable men, marriageable women ratios in different parts of the country. And just find there are some places where it's really hard, I mean, just numbers wise, for young women to meet young men of their, educational, sort of status. I think New York City is one place where it's hard for young women who are well educated to meet young men who are, in their same position, right?
That checks with what I've seen from people my age.
Numbers wise.
Yeah.
And there are other places where there are more young men than there are young women who would be eligible for marriage. So like, this is, not news people necessarily want to hear, but, if you're thinking about marriage as an important life goal and you're not dating anyone, you may want to think about, your next career, step in terms of, are there going to be, do I know that there's a group of young men or young women out there who would be, eligible to marry and, interested in marriage? Or is this the kind of like city or community context where people are not very interested in marriage, or there aren't that many women or men, who might be eligible for marriage? So that's certainly the kind of thing that, and we do see in terms of like the empirical evidence here that young adults who are religious, for instance, and young adults who are conservative, for instance, are more likely to be getting married than their peers who are secular and their peers who are progressive. And so that tells us it's not just sort of this random thing where you just magically find someone who kind of, is a good fit, that there are cultural and other currents that shape your odds of finding someone. And that if you're looking to get married, you should be attentive to those currents and steer your life in the direction that's going to put you in a better place to meet a mate.
Would that even be true for conservative men, given that there are so many more conservative men than women?
So I've looked at women who, in terms of this, at the end of my book, I look at both conservative women and religious women and find that they're more likely to be married in their 18 to 40 bracket. I'd have to go back and look at the data for the men.
Yeah.
So, yep.
Is there an element of, personal habit, forgetting kind of the social element, but in terms of personal habits that people should cultivate? Because it does seem there's sort of a romance novel picture of, I'll find the person who completes me and our flaws will somehow cancel out, and that will be my soulmate. Is that true? Or are there ways in which people should be cultivating personal habits that can make them happier in marriage?
Yeah, I do think that, focusing on dressing well, on staying physically fit, on having a clear kind of mission in life are things that women and men should be paying more attention to. And in my book, in my chapter on gender, I specifically talk about the ways in which women are more likely to be attracted to men who are physically strong, who are more protective, who are deemed to be more reliable breadwinners. And so unfortunately we know that a lot of young men today in a culture that often distracts them with, gaming devices and doesn't really kind of challenge them in school and hold up a constructive model of masculinity for them as they move through adolescence and into young adulthood, is giving us a world where too many young men are floundering, and I'm getting this from both liberal women and conservative women saying the same thing, they're complaining about the quality of men. And so I do think we need to keep encouraging our teenage boys and young men to be more intentional about, everything from physical fitness to their education to their vocational path. Now, I'm not saying to move in a workist direction or in the Midas mindset. I'm not saying that, and some young men are too work oriented and some young women are too work oriented. But there are unfortunately plenty of young men too who seem to have really no clear direction when it comes to their schooling and work. And it's those men who are not particularly attractive as potential husbands.
What about, you mentioned way back with the first question, you mentioned fidelity. And that also seems culturally, I think it's fairly common sense that a marriage in which someone's unfaithful is less stable. But in leading up to marriage, there is really an emphasis on, you should date as many people as possible. Is that bad advice?
So obviously fidelity is hugely important when it comes to forging a strong and stable marriage. And what we do see is that both for men and women, or for women and men, that young adults who've had a lot of relationships and a lot of cohabiting partners are more likely to end up divorced, and they're more likely to end up unhappily married. And this is weird, right? Because for most things in life, Annika, like more experience is a good thing.
Yeah.
Like the more experience you have teaching a class or playing tennis or football or whatever it might be, playing the piano, you generally become a better, practitioner of that craft or that sport. But when it comes to love and marriage, people who have a lot of experience with a lot of partners do worse. And I think there are probably two, we don't know exactly why. I think I've got two theories. One is it's kind of a critical comparison. So like if I've, lived with John and Hal and Larry, but I'm married to Adam, like Adam may not measure up. He may be a good guy, but he's not as ambitious as the first partner. He's not as funny as the second partner. And he's, not as emotionally in tune with me as my third partner. And he's like overall, a good guy and my husband. I love him. But there could be a way in which lots of other experiences with serious relationships could, negatively color how you look at your spouse, right? That's one theory. And the other theory I think that's relevant here is just that you've had experience breaking up from serious relationships. And so when things have gone south, you know what it means to leave the relationship and start anew. And so probably divorce is less likely to be, out of your thinking than it would be for someone who's just kind of, so and I'm not saying you marry the first person you meet either, right? I'm just saying that the strategy here is you kind of move slowly, both physically and emotionally when it comes to people and test the waters. And if you seem like there's a basis for a good friendship, and there's a real attraction there, then, and it's mutual, and these things often take time too, right? But if you kind of reach the point where with someone, there's this, this deep and abiding friendship, mutual love and admiration and respect, then you get engaged and get married. But if at some point in that process, you have the sense that this is not a good fit or this person's not as attracted to you as you are to them, then that's when you begin to, break things off and look for someone else.
Yeah, it's funny. I saw an article, I think on Facebook a few months ago, where they had, some study found that if you have had fewer sexual partners, you're more sexually satisfied when you're married.
Correct.
And I have never seen vitriol like I saw in that comment section. People were upset. And a lot of what they were saying was, I guess, the negative spin on what you just said. It's like, oh, if you don't have any standard of comparison, you'll be happy with anything. But it was interesting, the level of emotion that it brought out of average people on Facebook.
Right. No, obviously most people today have more than one partner heading into marriage. And so, it's a very different culture than it was, in some bygone era. So that's just the reality. But I'm just saying, if you can kind of minimize your experiences heading into marriage, it looks like that's for most of us a good thing.
Hmm. I mean, there's a stereotype, I think, among men, again, especially this sort of very online type of man, that women like only care about money. And among women, the attitude is, men only really care about looks and maybe youth to some extent. Um, is is that true? Are people actually kind of be more holistic about factors, or is that sort of more cynical take on what men and women are really after true?
I think that looks and money are important for kind of the initial stage of courtship, but I don't think that they are, the be all and end all, right? So I think that's it's important to basically just acknowledge and appreciate that looks and financial prospects are part of the picture, but not the only picture. And obviously throughout time and space, couples with a wide range of physical and financial resources, or endowments, have gotten together and married and had families. And so I'm looking for a world where a wide range of different kinds of people can forge a way to connect and date and mate and marry.
So I'm interested to move into, you say a lot of pretty interesting stuff about the political implications in your book, and especially talking about class differences. But just to kind of kick off this portion of the conversation, you call out the elites in the title of your book, which was really kind of coming out guns blazing. What leads you to label this as specifically an elite phenomenon? Because I think in responses, this is one of the things that really seems to bother people, that you're pinning it specifically on kind of elite messaging.
Yeah, I mean, it was kind of funny. One of the first journalists to object to my framing of the book's subtitle when the book was released on Twitter in the fall was himself a starring figure in the book, as someone who kind of had published a piece in Vox kind of saying that the decline of marriage is not a problem, right? So, the irony here is, and of course the rejoinder here is that elites are saying, well, us elites are doing things great as, when it comes to marriage. Why are you, saying defy the elites? Well, my point is not what you're practicing, it's what you're preaching or not preaching, right? Is the whole point of my book on that score. And I'm saying that too many of our elites talk left and walk right when it comes to marriage. In their own lives, they're often leading very marriage centered lives, good husbands, good wives, good parents, great, good for you. But when it comes to their roles, their professional and public roles as journalists or professors or school superintendents or C-suite executives or Hollywood moguls, they're often not doing anything to underline the value and importance of marriage. They're not producing TV shows or movies. They're not kind of incorporating curricula into their public high schools. They're not, writing accurate articles in Vox that tell us the truth about marriage and family. So I'm not looking for, some kind of treacly rose-colored thing. I'm just looking for the truth. And the truth is that on average, kids and adults and communities are more likely to be flourishing when stable marriage anchors their lives. And that message is not being told enough or fairly in too many elite cultural platforms.
Well, I also think Americans hate considering themselves to be elite or allied with elite. And I wonder if that word kind of upsets people for that reason.
Yeah, I'm sure it does. But again, I would like to see a world where, our cultural leaders would be more cognizant of their authority and influence when it comes to marriage and family, and do a better job of just, again, communicating the truth. And that is that kids are more likely to flourish when they have the benefit of married parents. And that's true also for adults too, and when they put a ring on it, on average.
So talk a little bit about the class differences here. And especially, I mean, this is another difficult topic. People do not like talking about class, but we're going to do it anyway. But I think in some ways it's kind of surprising that, the college educated group is actually doing pretty okay when it comes to marriage. And that working class families, who I think are still more religious in America, less so. So why is it that this kind of this ideology is having such disparate impact?
So talk about four groups of Americans who are succeeding at marriage today, and part of that's a class story, and that's what a lot of elites know about. They know that more educated, more affluent Americans are more likely to be getting married and staying married. So a majority of college-educated Americans are married today, 1855. Only minority of less educated Americans are married today. That's one example. But what most elites don't realize is that the same thing is true for religion, Asian Americans, and for conservatives. So a majority of religious Americans in that bracket are married. Only a minority of secular Americans in that bracket are married. A majority of Asian Americans, and depends on the survey, whites are married, and only a minority of Hispanics and African Americans are married. And then a majority of conservatives are married, and only a minority of liberals and moderates are married. So what we can see from this story is that both, in a sense, class and culture matter. And when it comes to class, I think part of the story here is that working class and poor couples are more likely to have men who are not stably employed full time in their communities. And it's still the case again in 2024 that women prefer to marry guys and to stay married to guys who are reliable breadwinners. Again, I'm not saying women can't work. I'm just saying that women who, including working women, prefer to have a husband who is, can be counted on to have a job. And that's, I think, partly just a kind of like a sign that he's got his stuff together and he's just sort of like, a decent guy. He's the kind of guy who can hold down a full-time job. But it's just interesting that there's more, I think, practical and symbolic value attached to his stable breadwinning, for couples than hers.
Interesting. Yeah, I mean, that was also one fact that really stuck out to me from the book when you said that matriarchal households, which are, so theoretically popular among the elite, are so much more common among the working class. That was, really sad, actually.
So I talked about breadwinner moms, and there's been a lot of reporting and research on breadwinner moms, and it's often held to be a great thing. But what's not told is it often involves either a single mom or a situation where the mom is doing more work financially and practically, in all domains of life, and the husband or the boyfriend is, not working as much outside the home and is more likely to be wasting time, or whatever, spending time, watching TV or playing Xbox, et cetera, while she is doing more to clean and cook and all that stuff. So as this thing kind of actually works its way out into the real world, it's more common for working class and poor communities and for upper middle class communities. It is often the source of tension and conflict for these working class and poor couples that I spoke with.
It does. You gave some pretty interesting examples of ways in which our tax code, among other things, but actual policies penalize marriage for the working class. This was quite frightening to read, but could you comment a little bit on that?
Sure. So one of the things that was striking to me about interviews and just ordinary life here in Charlottesville, in fact, I was having an event at a restaurant in town not too long ago on marriage. And after the event was over, the waitress approached me and was talking to me. And she said, oh, well, me and my husband, I think it was air quotes, and he works here in the restaurant too. He's a cook and I'm a waitress. And we've got 2 kids. We're actually not legally married because I'm on Medicaid and my 2 kids are on Medicaid. And so we know that if we were to get married and report our whole income, then I would lose access to Medicaid and our girls would. And I interviewed another couple with 2 kids in Virginia with the same exact scenario, for the book. And we see with the research too that, about 10% of, young adults who are not married in the lower half of the income ladder are saying that one reason that's the case is because they're concerned about losing government benefits, right? So this is a real thing, and it's just a consequence of the way in which our immune system programs are set up. It's complicated, but just the bottom line here is, unfortunately, programs like Medicaid and food stamps often penalize marriage for working class couples with children. And we should address this penalty in Washington with legislation.
Yeah, the financial portion of it, especially when it comes to kids, is really interesting to me. A lot of countries have pronatalist, policies surrounding trying to make it cheaper to have kids. But at the end of the day, having kids, just even if you stay married, having kids just sort of is expensive. To what extent do you think people who choose not to have kids, it's because of more ideological reasons versus just sort of financial reality?
So I think that's certainly part and parcel of what's happening. We do see, I think, in urbanized context, in places where there are high real estate costs, in places where education expenses are high. This is partly the story of South Korea, which is the lowest fertility rate of any country in the world, Annika. It's partly because, the costs of raising the next generation are very high. And the opportunity costs for women of stepping away from full-time work are extremely high as well. So yes, the financial piece is part and parcel of why I think we're seeing fertility fall in some places, in some regions of the world in dramatic ways, especially. But there's also just a cultural shift unfolding too, where I think more and more young adults are embracing what I call the Midas mindset. And it's all about education, work, and kind of building your own brand, living your own life, staying free of the encumbrances of a spouse, and especially children. Even we're hearing too, I was at an event in Nashville, Tennessee, and hearing about young adults are afraid of having kids. It's going to be so much of a strain. For the women, it's going to be, pregnancy is terrible and giving birth is horrible. So, this is, there's a big cultural shift that's kind of unfolding, and it's going to leave a lot of people heading into midlife and later life, either without a spouse or without children.
So there's one kind of scenario, and I'm curious as a demographer how you feel about it. But at least in principle, if you are one of the, 1 in 3 people my age who doesn't get married, you don't get married, you don't have kids, you don't pass on the same ideology that prevented you from having kids to the next generation, is it possible that we'll experience like a demographic funnel that will then go out? Or is there some other way in which these kind of values move from generation to generation?
Well, I think the big question is whether or not, more religious and conservative adults today who do tend to marry and have kids in larger numbers will transmit their worldview to the next generation. And if they do that, then they would kind of enjoy some kind of longer term demographic and cultural kind of benefit for their way of life. Up to now, though, we've seen plenty of young adults who've been raised in conservative and or religious homes, gravitate towards a more progressive or secular position, and so we don't see any kind of major shift towards religion or towards a more familistic way of life, unfolding yet. But the one exception to all that, right, is in the Jewish community. I grew up in Northeast, right, and plenty of friends and acquaintances who were Reform, conservative, and secular Jews. But now as I kind of navigate when I go back home, the Jewish world in the Northeast is much more dominated by Orthodox and ultra-Orthodox Jews.
Yeah.
In part because they've married in higher numbers, they've had kids in larger numbers, and they've done a better job of keeping kids in their own traditions. So I think that experience is interesting. And, I think that Catholics and Protestants who would like to kind of have greater success with retaining their kids might want to take some lessons from the Jewish community there.
Yeah, that is really interesting. Well, yeah, especially being one half secular Jew, I've definitely seen some of that play out. And also post October 7, a lot of my Jewish friends became radically more religious, including pretty secular ones, which was also...
That's interesting, yeah.
Yeah, so yeah.
You see how that plays out demographically.
Yeah, actually, that will be that will be an interesting. So I know that you're just about out of time, but to close us out here, we've sort of skirted around a little bit this idea that life is fundamentally kind of about a me first approach and what's going to bring me immediate happiness.
Exactly. Right.
And you've talked a lot in your book about the ways in which that's really detrimental towards marriage. Is marriage a sentence for never being able to put yourself first and for self-care not existing? And if so, is that good or bad?
No, of course not. Obviously, people who are reasonably happily married and who are thoughtful and considerate of their spouses make time for, their spouse to do, fun things. And whether it's a getaway with the girls, for a weekend or whatever it might be, a skiing trip with friends in Colorado or a religious retreat for that matter too, for people who are more religious, so but it is the case. You've got less free time for yourself. And I interviewed a young woman here in Virginia, and she's talking about when she was unmarried and childless, she had more time for blogs, she had more time, for restaurants and, any number of other kinds of things you could imagine, the sort of fun, freewheeling 20s phase of her life. But she's married with kids, and she talks about, she's got toddlers, and there's more mess, and there's more crying, and there's more stress, and that's. But from her perspective, her life is much more fulfilling than it was before she had a spouse and children, and she's a lot less lonely than she was as a 20-something single woman. And so as she kind of nets it all out from her perspective, there's no question that she is a happier woman, for all of this. Now, from a sociological position, though, the bigger question is, well, who is happiest among women, say, for instance, 1855? And what I can say is, looking just at the general social survey in front of me right here, that about 40% of married moms are very happy, compared to just 22% of women who are single with no kids. And then when it comes to who's not happy, basically, 25% of single women without kids are not happy, and only 13% of women who are married with kids are not happy. So despite what you might read in the New York Times, what you might read in the Washington Post last week, for instance, any number of mainstream media outlets who have been kind of depicting marriage often in a very negative light, who have been kind of leading us to think that, to just quote one New York Times writer recently, she said, "Married motherhood in America is a game no one wins."
Wow.
So maybe that was true for her, and she lives in Brooklyn, so who knows? There's something there's so many writers in Brooklyn. I don't know what the issue is there in Brooklyn. But anyways,
clearly not one of the Orthodox Jewish women.
Well, I guess not. Who knows? I'm just saying there's so many writers writing from Brooklyn complaining about marriage and motherhood. But again, across the U.S., married moms are nearly twice as likely to say that they're very happy with their lives compared to single childless women, and they're about half as likely to say that they're not too happy with their lives compared to single and childless women. So for most women, and then for most men as well, marriage and parenthood are sources of enormous meaning and purpose and direction. And again, most, but not all of the time, happiness.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for your time, Dr. Wilcox. This has been a real pleasure. Your book will be linked in the show notes. Everyone should check it out. It's in the imperative, get married. I'm doing my best. I'm trying.
Okay.
I was like, I'll do my best. But anyway, thank you so much. This has been really great.
Okay. Thanks, Annika. I appreciate the time.
Well, there you have it, Madisonians. Dr. Brad Wilcox on his new book, Get Married. It's linked in the show notes. There's tons of stuff in it that didn't come up in this interview, including, if you're a nerd like me, many more statistics, as well as a lot of individual stories. So I'd absolutely encourage you to give it a read. If you enjoyed this episode, first of all, you can leave us a rating or review, which we do always very much appreciate. But you might also be interested in learning more about the James Madison program and everything that we do here on Princeton's campus. And you can do that at our website, jmp.princeton.edu. Among other things, you can sign up for a mailing list. You can check out the recordings of all the previous lectures that we've hosted here at Princeton and see our schedule of upcoming events and other ways to get involved. You can also find us on social media, on Twitter at Madison Program, as well as on Instagram and Facebook. Again, thanks so much for tuning in, and I can't wait to see you next time here on Madison's Notes.